one actor, whether that's a state or a non-state actor, can achieve many objectives by operating below the threshold, by operating in the gray zone through different means of influencing, behaviors or certain outcomes.
Hello, I'm Alex Chinchilla.
And I'm Jacob Zach.
And welcome to Coffee with the Fellows, a new series from the Irregular Warfare Initiative.
Irregular Warfare Fellows include academics, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers working to advance the study and practice of irregular warfare. To learn more about irregular warfare and the IWI Fellowship, visit irregularwarfare.org.
And now, here's the episode. So welcome to Coffee with the Fellows. I'm here with two of IWI's very own fellows, Dr. John Pennell and Nicole Winget. John, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, John, you are a former U.S. Foreign Service officer, and you've worked all around the world, a special interest in Russia and Ukraine, and you're wearing a lot of different hats these days. Tell us about one of the projects you're really interested in.
Certainly. Again, great to be here with Nicole and both of you as well. So yes, I'm wearing many different hats, a contractor with the Department of War, also a fellow with several different organizations, including obviously the Irregular Warfare Institute, IWI. You mentioned Russia and Ukraine, and for me in particular, along with a colleague, we're tracking the latest developments on the use of artificial intelligence, AI, and other evolving technologies that are being increasingly utilized in the battle space in Ukraine and neighboring states. I recently co-authored an article about the use of AI and autonomous weapons in Ukraine and trying to do a follow-up piece to that. So really tracking the latest technological developments and seeing Ukraine as really like a laboratory where both Russia and Ukraine are testing out new methods of warfare.
That sounds fantastic. I'm sure we'll circle back to that as the conversation goes on. So our next guest is Nicole Winget. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you, Nicole. So you are a Navy Reserve officer and a dean and professor at Campbell University. So you also have a lot of different projects going on. And last time I checked in with you, you were at a series of Navy exercises. How did those go?
It was awesome. I'm affiliated with U.S. Fleet Forces, so it was great to get in and get some sets and reps and work across commands. And some of the things John was saying, I'm like, oh, I need to talk to you offline about that. It's always great to connect what we do with IWI with some of our real-world experiences.
That's fantastic. And really, the Navy, I guess, is the future of what we'll be focusing on after the Army having it sort of like golden day with the GWOT and coin.
It's a little egotistical, but I'd like to definitely say the Navy is the future.
Yeah, I bet there's a bunch of admirals that are not going to be complaining about what I just said at all.
Yep.
Well, we want to just get right into the episode today. We're going to be talking about what the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East are telling us about what the United States has learned from the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. Are we learning or are we repeating our mistakes?
Yeah, so the first question for today is, how have lessons learned from GWOT and coin been applied to modern warfare today or not been applied? What are your perspectives on that?
Sure. Thank you. Very good question. I myself served in both Afghanistan and Iraq as a civilian many years ago. So I'm thinking about this from a civilian perspective in particular, but obviously I've worked alongside our military and allies and partners as well. And so that also informs my thinking. So I think one good lesson seems to me that we've gone away from long-term, large-scale nation building. Obviously, we were in Afghanistan for roughly 20 years and Iraq for over 8 years. Both significant lengths of time, focusing on counterinsurgency, countering violent extremism, counterterrorism, et cetera. And while maybe terrorism, extremism are still issues today, it seems to me that we are able to rely more on special operations forces, maybe new technologies, such as drones, as we've been using for quite a long time, and other means to counter and mitigate those threats rather than going full on, boots on the ground, full-scale conventional warfare. So I think that's a good thing. And I think we learned from those two wars in particular that these wars are very costly in terms of blood and treasure, given all the deaths and the casualties and the taxpayer dollars that were invested in both places. So I do think that's one positive thing. I'll stop there.
Cole, does this ring true from your experience as well?
Very much so. And though while I am a sailor, my entire first 20 years of my career was in the desert. I affectionately refer to myself as a sand sailor. So I've deployed more with the Army than I have the Navy. And so what's being said very much rings true. I apologize. I can't remember where I read it, but I recently read a quote that said, we're focusing on high skill, low footprint. And I think that echoes what John is saying is one of the lessons that we learned from the global war on terror. One thing I'm concerned we didn't learn, and this may be more personal, but beware of underestimating our adversaries. And I'll use Ukraine and myself as a kind of a capsule of this. When the conflict first came out, I thought Ukraine was going to be done in 2 weeks. I thought this was going to be a 2-week done by Russia. And clearly that has not happened. And so that's been a reminder to me to not underestimate the power of messaging and how even the smallest, quote unquote, smallest adversaries can be a big challenge.
Yeah, that's certainly ringing true.
I would fully support what Nicole just said. And I think related to that, as I mentioned earlier on about areas of focus for me now about technology. One thing I've also seen, and this is somewhat academic, but also I think based on my practical experience as well, that while the nature of warfare hasn't changed, that the character or content or characteristics, if you will, are increasingly changing, meaning the means that are being used, the methods that are being used, smartphones, for example, are increasingly critical, not just for an average person to communicate with one another, but it's also a vector for disinformation, for AI-enabled, deep fakes and that sort of thing. But I think fundamentally, warfare's nature hasn't changed. Having said that, a lesson that I hope we learn, but I'm not 100% sure that we always are, is that, strategy and tactics need to be interconnected. I do worry at times that we sometimes focus too much on tactical successes or the use of tactics as a measure of strategy, where they're interrelated, but strategy comes down to certain political objectives. And echoing Clausewitz, I continue to believe that war is the use of policy by other means. And I think that's something that still reigns true to today.
Cole, I mean, that definitely sounds like something that would ring true with your experience as well.
John is singing the song of my people. Absolutely. And I love that you brought up that strategy and tactics need to be intertwined, and we can't get lost in the sauce for the tactical things that work and say, okay, we can apply this universally. And John, as you were talking, I was thinking, modern technology and drones and AI, and then thinking about how some of our adversaries have pivoted to, for lack of a better term, dumb technology. And then they're countered in their own way, like Israel attacking the pager system and the walkie-talkies. And that interplay between using higher technology and then it not working. So you go down to lower level technology, and it's this back and forth battle, I guess is the best way to put it. We're seeing that play out in many of our conflicts. Where is that 12 nautical miles starting and stopping? And where can we build an island so that our 12 nautical miles become even bigger? So, yeah.
Thanks, Nicole. We also wanted to get your take on another question, which is, if either of you were to design a lessons learned playbook for today's strategic competition, what are some of your kind of top 2 to 3 do's or don'ts drawn from the GWOT era?
The two thoughts that popped right to my mind are, don't forget about the public perception and the general public interaction, both how our own people perceive things and then how our adversaries' civilization is viewing what we're doing. I think that's a must that we sometimes forget about. And then again, I go back to the power of messaging. For those of you who are glued to the news, which I'm sure is everyone on this call, the Russian the Grey Fleet tanker that the UK interdicted this weekend. UK put out a video within like 30 minutes of them sweeping the ship. That's really powerful messaging and can influence a public perception. So really the power of messaging and don't forget about the public perception would be my two biggest playbook entries.
I have to play devil's advocate for a second here, though, because one of the things you get out of the GWOT, though, that I think is so surprising is actually how uninvolved the public was. Like, if you look at Afghanistan, for example, like right before President Biden says we have to withdraw, there wasn't really demand coming from the public for that. All the polls essentially show that the intervention was sustainable. So I hear you, and we see governments making all these attempts to message, but at the same time, we also see these examples of conflict that just don't seem to really involve the public at all. So, like, how do we square that circle?
I think the reason it didn't involve the public is because we, the royal we, stopped messaging. If you take Afghanistan, look what happened after the withdrawal did not go well. There was outrage because the messaging, you saw the TikTok clips and the Instagram reels. People forget. So if we aren't doing constant messaging, good, bad, or indifferent, then the public stops paying attention. So that goes back to your point is very well taken that the public didn't seem to be involved, but I think that's partially on the fact that there wasn't anything dramatic happening. There wasn't, constant things that could be snipped together and put out in news clips. And so it was easy for the public to, I hate to say forget, but that's the best way I can put it is forget.
Maybe it's connected to that strategic failure that John was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So for me, I would echo everything Nicole just said, full stop. And I would also add, related to some of the points that were made earlier, Nicole, you said earlier on about not underestimating your adversary. And so that definitely ties into one of my points is, the enemy gets a vote and understand that and recognize that. I think that's a do for sure. And obviously the opposite is a don't. But I also think as we talk about economic and legal warfare, influence warfare, information, operations, information environment, et cetera, I think it's also very, very critical, again, linked to strategy and tactics that when we're devising a playbook to counter a particular threat or to pursue a particular political objective, whatever that may be, that we must integrate and do a better job and always think about ways to do a better job of integrating all instruments of power, across the full spectrum. I know for those who've gone to the War College or one of the War Colleges, we refer to it as the dime or the dime fill. There are many other ways to describe that, but using all tools at our disposal in an integrated way, I think is a must. Obviously, that's much easier said than done, but that's certainly a do for me.
So one follow-up question I had to that, John, actually, given that a huge portion of career before this has been spent working with state, is how to actually do that interagency cooperation. We had General Cleveland on the Irregular Warfare podcast, and one of the things he was talking about is just that it's sort of both an organizational and a cognitive problem, and that people don't fully understand the ways that irregular warfare operates, and we don't have the government organizations to actually make that interagency cooperation happen. What did you see as perhaps good examples of being able to bridge those gaps and other things that maybe didn't work as well?
It's an excellent question. There are many different issues. There's culture, there's resources, there's authorities, there are personalities and interorganizational authorities, if you will, challenges. Any one of them is extremely difficult to overcome. All of them together, of course, challenging. However, there are structures in place. Whether they're effective or not, I think, is debatable. But there certainly is a National Security Council, speaking specifically from a U.S. perspective, that is supposed to develop policy that the rest of us, if we're working in the executive branch, should be following. And so, given my time overseas, working, a number of different U.S. embassies for most of the last 25 years, the way it operates in the field, so to speak, is you have an ambassador, also known as a chief of mission. You've got the country team representing all elements of U.S. executive branch agencies, including the Department of War, the intelligence community, those who are providing assistance, et cetera. And there actually is a process there. Obviously, it doesn't always work perfectly. There's a lot of friction over a number of different issues that we could talk about in more detail. But I would say overall, in my experience, that things do work pretty well. I think when they don't work well, it can be, again, due to challenges over resources or unclear authority, personalities. Resources is always a big one. Again, speaking from the U.S. perspective, when you look at the budgets for the Department of Defense before, Department of War now, compared with civilian agencies, there's always one that dwarfs the other, which I would advocate, having a better balance, I think is beneficial. So I would see that as kind of one challenge. So it's not perfect by any means, but I think there are processes in place to help deal with this. But it's always a work in progress, I would say.
I like that answer because it gives me hope that essentially there are a lot of things that can be done at the practitioner level, at the working level, that can help get us closer to this, even without having a new government organization or completely changing education of the security cooperation workforce, for example.
Inshallah.
Of course, always.
I think John's a little more optimistic than I am, and maybe it's just my intelligence community experience. You talked resources, and I think that it hits the nail on the head. That seems to be a major area. But what ends up happening is because we're all trying to keep our resources, we're not always great about sharing information. We're not always great about giving credit where credit is due. I don't think anybody means to go into it being egotistical, but we tend to protect. I kicked off this call joking about how the Navy's the future, because of course I think the Navy's the future. It's our human nature to really value the area that we're working in, and I'm looking at it through the lens of the intelligence community, but there's definitely competition that can sometimes cause issues. And we've tried to put things in place post 9/11 to reduce it. I'm not as optimistic that friction is as low as I would like it to be, but I guess it's on me and my peers to try to keep knocking down that friction.
I would agree, though, everything Nicole said as well. And I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture. I think the point I was trying to make is there are processes in place, whether or not they work or work well. I think that's open to debate, and I think Nicole just highlighted that.
Fair point, John. So real softball here as we move toward the end of our conversation. So we've talked about how warfare has sort of evolved over the past couple decades. What does victory look like in an era of strategic competition?
That's your softball question.
Yeah, that's
I'll
the $1
defer to
million question,
Nicole.
Jacob.
No, John, that's all you.
Yikes.
That's a really hard one. Do you have any words of wisdom, John? Because I'm struggling on what that looks like.
So for me, the way I see it, and not only because I'm a fellow with the Irregular Warfare Initiative or I'm a contractor with the Irregular Warfare Center, obviously irregular warfare is in my vein, so to speak, but I do see this era of strategic competition as one of continuous competition, mostly below the threshold. And it's not only against adversaries or peer competitors, but it can also be with allies as well. I think that's just a common theme of the international system these days, particularly with, I mentioned earlier on about all these different technologies and how they continue to evolve, that in my perspective, not to say that kinetic actions, kinetic activities, use of military hard power is no longer relevant. Of course, it still is. But I think we're seeing where the world continues to be very highly interconnected. Economic warfare, legal warfare, let alone information warfare. I would consider these things as continuous. And so I would say victory is something that may be hard to obtain. And obviously, it's going to be in the eye of the beholder, at least from my perspective. I think maybe victory could be an understanding of just this is the system that we're operating under, and how do we achieve objectives in this system? So maybe it's just an understanding of what the reality is.
I don't think I have an answer for what victory looks like because there are so many pieces. I actually have a sticker on the back of my laptop. There's a saying we have in the law that it depends is the answer to everything. But I think one of the elements of victory is having control of, if we can say we're controlling the disinformation and battling it, where both our general public, our military members, our decision makers have valid information and can see through the disinformation, that is a sign of victory, or a key to victory would be a better way to put it. I have no way to, there's so many elements that can go into what victory looks like, that I would say is a key to victory or a sign that we're leaning towards victory.
Yeah, I would also echo that last point. I think, one way, again, I don't think it's ever going to be clear cut, but I think just in the information space, a better understanding of the environment and the mis and disinformation that's out there can be a means to an end, not necessarily victory in itself.
Yeah, I'm just learning a lot from this conversation. I want something I can measure and get my hands on, and I'm going to know if it's real or it's not. But your answers are making me think that the thing that might matter is not actually winning, but people thinking you're winning. And, if I think about Russia and Ukraine, like one of the greatest misinformation things that Russia has been able to spin over the past 3 years is that it's winning the war in Ukraine. It's like the meme from The Office. If you look at Russia's territorial gains in 26 and 2023, it's the same picture, right? So, they haven't really been winning, but yet they were able to convince a lot of people that they were. So this is giving me a new perspective on winning.
It was Sun Tzu who talked about deception and how, important that is. Russia's use of maskirovka, also a form of deception. Going back to Sun Tzu, the idea that you can achieve victory without actually fighting, that should be the ultimate objective. So I think controlling the narrative, the influence, the information aspects of this are extremely key, but that's much harder said than done.
Well, and Alex, you spoke about Russia's messaging, but I think Ukraine's a great example too. I think part of the reason they were able to push through the first 6 months was they did some excellent information campaigns. The grandma with the sunflower, all those kind of things are very powerful, and they're both doing it and in different ways doing it well.
So I have one final question for you both. So since this is Coffee with the Fellows, Jacob and I have to ask, what's in your mug this morning?
Coffee with sugar-free creamer, girl. I am definitely, we were joking about our mugs. Here's my Campbell University mug. So
very nice.
Hopefully my boss watches this. But coffee with sugar-free cream, that's the way to go.
So for me, I'm usually just all black tea, at least in the morning, and then I try to switch to iced tea. So I actually have my Irregular Warfare Initiative mug spot on, but it's with iced tea though. It is the afternoon, so.
Yeah, I brought my my St. Javelin mug for the occasion,
Nice.
And because it's Houston summer and I'm trying to still make up for my run this morning, it's actually filled with electrolytes. How about you, Jacob?
I have a very similar routine to John. I start with black tea in the morning, and then in the afternoon I go green tea. So got a little bit of tea here.
Awesome. So this is about at our time, but I want to hear from each of you, Nicole and John. What is one single thing you'd want a practitioner to carry away from today's conversation?
The power of messaging, and to think about how many different avenues there are to message. When we're talking irregular warfare or preventing war or declaring victory, the power of messaging is, I think it's always been important, but it's at a level we've never historically seen because of how many methods we have to communicate now. So don't forget the power of messaging.
I would agree with that. Maybe I would also add, kind of based upon that it's important to think of where we are today, as we've been seeing for the last, let's say, 12 years or so in Ukraine on the information front, but also with new technologies, that we're likely in a persistent state of indirect, asymmetric, hybrid, gray zone, irregular warfare, whatever you want to call it, where, again, not to diminish the military hard power element, still absolutely critical, but that we are seeing more and more that state and non-state actors are pursuing their interests in a means that is often below the threshold, or is at least allowing for plausible deniability and trying to avoid eliciting a conventional military response.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us on Coffee with the Fellows.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Coffee with the Fellows. If you like the show, please spread the word and consider sharing this episode with others. You can engage with Irregular Warfare Initiative on X, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and other platforms. And one last thing. What you heard in this episode are the views of the participants and do not represent those of West Point, Princeton University, the Irregular Warfare Initiative, the U.S. Naval War College, or any other agency of the U.S. or any other government. Thanks again for being part of this community, and we'll see you next time.